Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm here to wrap up my July monthly reading priority, which was new releases. If you're not familiar with my monthly priorities, I will link a video and playlist about them below, but basically in July I focused on reading a bunch of different new releases. So in this video I'm going to wrap up what I read, talk about some of the themes that I saw, and also recommend a couple of my favorites for you. So this month I ended up reading 18 books, which were new releases, 7 of which were graphic works, so pretty short, and only 1 of which was actually on my TBR. So let's start with the book that was on my TBR, which was Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley. This is a YA mystery thriller, and it is about a teenage girl who is half white, half Ojibwe, and she's trying to figure out what's going on in her community because a bunch of girls are ending up dead. This has really excellent discussions of a lot of the issues that face Indigenous communities, and I thought that was so well done. It is a little bit fast-paced towards the end with a little bit of drama, which makes sense for the mystery thriller. Not so much my style, but I think anybody who likes mystery thrillers is gonna like that part, and I think this book had so much to say. Now moving on to the books that weren't on my TBR, beginning with A Master of Djinn by P. Djèlí Clark. I do have a standalone review for this, so I will link it below. This is a alternate history, sort of steampunk novel set in P. Djèlí Clark's Dead Djinn universe. So there are a couple of short stories and novellas that precede this, but you could read it as a standalone and that's totally fine. It is set in this alternate version of the 1912 in Cairo, when 40 years prior, a man called Al-Jahiz had opened up the portal between the universe where the Djinn reside and the real world. And now we have somebody who is claiming to be Al-Jahiz returned, except that this person has also murdered an entire group of people, and so we follow Agent Fatma, who is trying to uncover what is going on. So this is also a mystery. I definitely enjoyed all of the world building in this. I love P. Djèlí Clark's writing. I love the political themes that he addresses. The mystery was a little too easy to guess for me, and the pacing was a little slower than I liked, but I still really enjoyed this one. Next, I read The Witness for the Dead by Katherine Addison, which is a companion novel to The Goblin Emperor. This is set in a sort of low fantasy world where there are goblins and elves and a little bit of magic. We follow a person who is what is called a witness for the dead, which means that he can speak to the spirits of recently departed people to try to make sure that they get whatever justice they need. And he ends up having to do this for a woman who was murdered. And so we follow him as he's trying to kind of talk to people, interview them, find out what happened to her, and just see that justice happens. This is something that I really, really loved because it is just such a cozy mystery feel in this fantasy setting. And I just really love the goodness of the characters that Katherine Addison writes. So this was thoroughly enjoyable. In contrast, I also really enjoyed The Chosen and the Beautiful by Nghi, which has atrociously bad characters. This is a retelling of The Great Gatsby, but with magic and a lot of queerness, and the characters are all pretty awful people, just like in the original. This is really fantastically written. It is so luscious. The writing is incredibly atmospheric. I loved the magic. I loved the excesses of this as well, just the way you feel like you're in the roaring 20s. I did feel that at the end it kind of lost its way a little bit, but even so, I really enjoyed the experience of reading this one. Another book with very flawed characters that I liked quite a lot was The Return of the Sorceress by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. I do have a review for this, so I will link it below. This is a very short novella that is sort of a sword and sorcery style of fantasy world, but based on Mesoamerican myth and culture. And we follow a woman who was basically a high priestess, and she was a little bit dethroned by her ex-lover, and now she is trying to claw her way back into power. And this is all about her and her relationship to power and the choices that she made in the past and the choices that she's going to make in the future. She's definitely a flawed character, and I loved her for this. I really enjoyed the magic system and the world building, and I really liked the arc of the plot as well. So I thought this was a great novella. Next, I read The Impossible Resurrection of Grief by Octavia Cade. This is a sort of near future dystopian-ish science fiction where the world has gone a little bit worse than it already is in terms of climate change, and a lot of species and plants and things have died out, including things like the Great Barrier Reef. And we follow a scientist who is dealing with people around her succumbing to something called the grief, which is where people really lose all sense of reality due to their grief over the death of animals and plants and all sorts of aspects of Earth, just that grief and guilt that humans feel over that. And she has a colleague who succumbs to that. And she also finds out that there might be a little bit of a conspiracy of what some of the people who have succumbed to the grief are doing. So this is a little bit of a mystery thriller, but it's very slow and it's also very literary. I had a hard time understanding the ending of this, but the writing was so gorgeous and I just loved the emotions that it evoked and just this discussion of ecological change. Next, I read Cece Rios in the Desert of Souls by Kaela Rivera. This is a middle grade fantasy that is set in a world that is kind of a desert, and we have a community that worships the sun god. And it's all about fire and strength and bravery. And they do a lot to ward off the criatura, or kind of monster spirits that live in the desert. We follow Cece, who has a family that is filled with very strong women, but she is somebody who they call her somebody who has like a water heart or water spirit, which is looked down upon in their culture because she isn't so fiery. But she ends up needing to find her bravery and find her strength in order to help her family. This is filled with a ton of really, really cool Latin American inspired culture and myth and all sorts of adventure. I really liked the growth arc as well for Cece Rios. It was such an enjoyable read. Another middle grade I loved was Res Dogs by Joseph Bruchac. This is told in verse and it is set in 2020 at the onset of the pandemic. And it is about a young girl who is Wabanaki and she is visiting her grandparents on the reservation. And while she's there, the outbreak happens of COVID-19 and she has to kind of shelter in place with her grandparents while her parents are actually still in Boston. And so this is about her dealing with being there on the reservation, trying to, connect to her classes via the internet, which is very spotty on the reservation, and just talking about, again, a lot of issues of being Indigenous in the modern US and a lot of the history as well that many Indigenous peoples have gone through and how they have gone through a number of pandemics and other very life-threatening situations before. It just does such a great job of touching on a lot of really important issues, but in a way that is very, very approachable for a middle grade audience. Plus, it involves a semi-magical dog that appears and is helping her through this tough time. Next, I read The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans, which is a short story collection of contemporary works that are really addressing a lot of issues of things that affect Black women. And so all of these stories are really focusing in on a lot of women who have to make kind of difficult choices or they're in difficult circumstances. Lots of flawed people, but also there's so much heart. The writing is absolutely beautiful, and I just loved the way that these stories explored so many different people's experiences and all kinds of things that they had to make choices between. I do have a standalone review for this, so I will link it below. I absolutely loved this one. Next is a nonfiction, Already Toast by Kate Washington. This is sort of a memoir / manifesto talking about care work in the US. So Kate Washington is an author, and she's somebody who had to become a caregiver for her husband when he developed a very severe form of leukemia, went through some very, very intense stays in the hospital, and now is at home but disabled. And so this is all about her being kind of placed in this position where she has to give care where that is not a thing that she has ever really felt called to do, and sort of examining her feelings and her resentment and a lot of issues of the way that women are often placed into caregiving roles, and how the system in the US is very much set up to not respect or compensate that work. So I thought that this did a great job of really talking about the way that the system is set up and how sexist a lot of it is. But I do think that there were some things that didn't work for me so much in this. Things like she does a lot of literary analysis and comparison of classic works of literature in her situation. And also just there's a couple of things in this that were slightly uncomfortable, just things like she's still with her husband, but the resentment there was very, very intense. Even so, this book really made me think, and I definitely feel like that impacted my lens through which I view caregiving in a lot of different works. Next, I read another memoir sort of essay style collection, which is World of Wonders by Amy Nizukumatatil, illustrated by Fumi Nakamura. So this is a collection of essays about nature, about animals and plants, interwoven with Nizukumatatil's own memoir. And a lot of these sort of explorations of these different animals and plants tied into her own experiences. It's a very moving collection. It's beautifully written, and if you like nature writing and memoir, I think this would definitely work for you. Another nature nonfiction that I absolutely loved was Crazy for Birds by Misha Minarek-Blaze. This is such a fun collection of bird facts. It's beautifully illustrated, just intense, vibrant colors. I love the stylized way that everything is drawn, and it's just a celebration of birds. It's all about birds and their habitat and their feathers and their eggs and all sorts of things, as well as humanity's connection to birds. If you want an uplifting, fun, information-filled book all about birds, this is definitely one worth picking up. Next, I read a graphic memoir, Dancing at the Pity Party by Tyler Fetter, and this is all about Fetter going through the experience when she was in her early 20s of losing her mother to cancer. And this is one just gorgeously illustrated. I love the style. It's so soft and gentle, and two, so moving. This is all about the connection that she had with her mom and really that experience of losing her so quickly to illness and how her family grieved and how that still affects her. It was so moving, and just really, if you like memoirs and you like books kind of discussing grief, this was such a good one. Next, I read Spy X Family Volume 2 by Tatsuya Endo, translated by Casey Lowe. This is a manga, the second volume in a series that is absolutely hilarious. The premise of this is sort of a Cold War type of era, and we follow a spy, Twilight, who has to infiltrate a very elite academy, and so he has to get a fake wife and a fake daughter in order to do so, and unbeknownst to him, the wife that he recruits is actually an assassin, and the daughter that he recruits is a telepath. And it's just so many antics, but also with a lot of heart and discussion of kind of found family. Then I read The Girl from the Sea by Molly Knox Ostertag, which is a YA graphic novel all about a girl who kind of falls in love with a Selkie. This is a story that is really gorgeously illustrated. I love the soft, gentle curves of all of the drawings, and it really explores a lot of issues of coming out. It was definitely a sweet story. It had a little bit of drama in it, but was also kind of touching on some ecological issues, which I liked as well. And then I read some picture books, beginning with We Wait for the Sun by Debbie Johnson Roundtree and Katie McCabe, illustrated by Raisa Figueroa. This is a really gorgeously illustrated, very short little picture book that is recounting a childhood memory of Debbie Johnson Roundtree, who was a civil rights lawyer. And it's all about her and her grandmother picking berries in the pre-dawn and waiting for the sun. It is just a very sweet story, but also in the kind of end matter of the book, Katie McCabe, who did a biography on Debbie Johnson Roundtree, talks about the importance of this story and what it meant for Debbie Johnson Roundtree to have this hope for the future with her grandmother. It was really moving and beautifully illustrated. Then, because I loved the illustrations from that so much, I found another book by the same illustrator, Una by Kelly DiPuccio, illustrated by Raisa Figueroa. This is about a little mermaid with an otter friend who are constantly in search of treasure, and one day they find a treasure that is very hard to get to. It's all about persistence and problem solving. It is just incredibly illustrated and has such sweet stories to it. And lastly, I read How I Survived 4 Nights on the Ice by Surabio Itusarjuit, illustrated by Matthew K. Hody. This is a picture book that tells the story of the author Itusarjuit, who ended up stranded on the ice. He is Inuit and he lived in the very northern reaches of Canada and got stranded on the ice one day and was out there for 4 days alone. So this is just about how he used traditional Inuit knowledge to survive that situation. It is just a really interesting story. Didn't love the illustrations so much, but still a very neat experience that he went through. Okay, so those are all of the books that I read this month. Now I want to talk about some of the themes that I saw. Normally I do these themes and I have things that emerge because the authors have shared experiences and often there are themes across that. This time the authors were from pretty wide backgrounds and really the thing joining it all together was that they were all published in 2020 or 2021, and so, you know, everybody's living in the same world. I also think the other thing that ties these all together is the fact that I chose to read them. So some of the themes that I'm noticing here may be because of my taste in books, but in any case, let me tell you what I noticed. So the first theme that I saw was justice. A lot of the books that I picked up really talked about justice. So in Firekeeper's Daughter, this story is all about the main character trying to bring justice for these girls who have been murdered. Similarly, in The Witness for the Dead, this is all about the main character trying to bring justice for a woman who was murdered. In the Office of Historical Corrections, especially in the title story, so there's a novella within this collection called The Office of Historical Corrections, it's really about justice for history. So in that story, there is an office of historical corrections, which goes around and provides corrections for historical inaccuracies, and it features especially 2 Black women in that department who have different versions of how they approach correcting the historical record, especially when it comes to what has happened to a lot of Black people. And it's a great discussion of what justice means and what it means especially for Black women in modern day US. Also in The Impossible Resurrection of Grief, this is a little bit of a darker side of justice, but in a sense, it's justice for the earth, for what has been happening in terms of mass extinctions, and that the grief, right? That way that people are affected deeply, emotionally and mentally by what they have done to the earth is a form of justice. Another theme that I noticed was survival. So in How I Survived 4 Nights on the Ice, that was literally a survival tale. In Dancing at the Pity Party, it's more of an emotional survival. That story is all about somebody working through very, very intense grief and being able to keep living their life. In Already Toast, that story is about somebody surviving a very harrowing experience and surviving through the incredible stress of a loved one going through a great illness and with them trying to provide a lot of care, which is very taxing on the caregiver as well. And in Res Dogs, the story is all about surviving not just COVID-19, but everything else that has inflicted itself upon Indigenous cultures and Indigenous communities in the past many hundred years. And the last theme that I noticed, and I think this is because of my taste in books, was hope. So the first one that I noticed this in was We Wait for the Sun, which is that story of the childhood of the civil rights lawyer who is waiting with her grandmother for the sun to rise. It's just very symbolic. In Una, which is the Little Mermaid, she is fighting to figure out how to get the treasure that she wants that is very hard to get to, and she has hope and she gets through it and she figures out a solution. In The Girl from the Sea, I think this is hopeful because it's a story of somebody finding a way to come out and to share with her friends and her family who she really is inside. And in Cece Rios, similarly, this is a story about a girl who is trying to figure out who she is and gain acceptance from those around her and kind of show that she has value. So all of these just really focused on women coming into their own and finding hope that they can be who they want to be. So I thought that was just something that really appealed to me, but obviously there is a little bit of a selection bias here. And lastly, I wanted to go ahead and recommend 3 books from this month that I think really you should pick up. So many of the things that I read were really, really excellent. So if any of them appeal to you, definitely pick them up. But because there are so many books that I talked about, I really do want to highlight just 3 that I think, if you don't have time to read them all, these are the ones that I'd highly recommend. Starting with Dancing at the Pity Party by Tyler Fetter. This is a graphic memoir. It does not take a long time to read, and it is so impactful. I really, truly cried throughout most of this because I was so moved, and I just loved the way that Fetter described her experiences, talked about that experience of grief, and talked about all of her emotions. I get so moved even just remembering it. I absolutely loved this. Next, I'd like to recommend The Return of the Sorceress by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is another short read. It is a very short novella, under 100 pages, and it is just such a great fantasy adventure. I loved having a dislikable female protagonist. I loved the magic. I loved just the story arc for the character. It was such a good book, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. And lastly, I'd like to recommend The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. This is a very, very well-written short story collection that talks about a lot of different modern issues from the perspective of Black women. And I just think that the sort of darkness of a lot of the stories is balanced out by a very subtle humor, and it just touches on so many topics that I think are fascinating. Plus, it's just so well written, so I definitely recommend this one. Okay, so that wraps up my July monthly reading priority. If you guys have read any of the books that I've mentioned, if you have any thoughts, any of these you want to read, if you read any new releases that you think I should read, anything at all, just leave me a comment down below.